The Four Noble Truths, a path to liberation. There is a moment in life when we pause and ask, why do I suffer? Perhaps it comes in the silence after a loss, in the weight of unmet expectations, or in the restless pursuit of something just beyond our grasp. Suffering in its many forms touches every human heart. But what if suffering was not just an inevitable burden, but a door to wisdom? More than 2,500 years ago, a prince-turned-seeker named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a tree and awakened to a profound truth, one that would change the course of history. What he discovered was not divine revelation, nor a philosophy of blind faith, but a clear and direct understanding of life as it truly is. When he stood up from that tree, now known as the Buddha, he carried with him a gift, the Four Noble Truths. This teaching is not a doctrine to be believed, but a path to be walked. It does not ask you to accept anything on faith alone, but to observe your own life with honesty and curiosity. If suffering is real, can we understand it? If we understand it, can we move beyond it? Come, let us walk together through this teaching, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a guide to freedom. The journey begins with seeing life clearly. Let us begin. The setting of the first teaching. After 6 years of intense seeking, of self-denial and meditation so deep that his body wasted away, Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath the Bodhi tree and made a vow. He would not rise until he found the truth that ended suffering. And in the stillness of that night, as the morning star rose in the sky, he awakened. The man who had searched, the prince who had renounced his kingdom, had become the Buddha, the awakened one. But what is the use of a truth if it is not shared? The Buddha looked upon the world, knowing that the path to liberation lay open before him, yet he hesitated. Could anyone truly understand? The depth of his insight was vast, like the ocean, while the minds of ordinary people seemed small, like cups. How could the ocean be poured into a cup? Then he saw them, 5 men, former companions from his days of harsh asceticism. They had walked with him when he starved his body in the forests, believing that suffering itself was the path to truth. When Siddhartha abandoned extreme self-denial and chose the middle way, they turned away from him, thinking he had failed. But now, with the clarity of his awakening, the Buddha knew they were ready to listen. He traveled to the deer park in Sarnath, where the 5 ascetics still practiced. As he approached, they saw him from a distance and whispered to one another, "Do not bow to him. He has abandoned the path." Yet, as he drew near, something about his presence, his radiant peace, the depth in his gaze, softened their hearts. They could not help but listen. And so, in that quiet grove, the Buddha spoke for the first time as the awakened one. He turned the wheel of Dharma with a single teaching, the Four Noble Truths. This was not just a sermon. It was the foundation of all Buddhist thought, the first step on a path that would spread across centuries and continents. In that moment, something remarkable happened. Kondanya, the eldest of the 5, listened with such deep attention that understanding arose within him. He saw, truly saw, that suffering had a cause, and if it had a cause, it could be ended. With this realization, he became the first disciple of the Buddha, the first to take refuge in the Dharma. The path had begun. That night in the deer park was more than a historical event. It was the birth of a tradition, a way of seeing the world that has endured for over 2 millennia. And now, as we explore these 4 noble truths together, we too step into that same stream of wisdom. The Four Noble Truths. Understanding the nature of life. When the Buddha spoke in the deer park, he did not offer abstract theories or mystical revelations. He spoke of life as it is, in a way that anyone could see for themselves. He laid out a simple yet profound framework, four truths that, when understood deeply, have the power to transform suffering into wisdom. The first noble truth, the reality of suffering, Dukkha. Life in its very nature contains suffering. This is not a pessimistic view, nor is it meant to instill despair. Rather, it is an invitation to look deeply and recognize what we often try to ignore. Suffering is not always loud or dramatic. It can be the quiet restlessness that lingers even in moments of joy, the subtle dissatisfaction that whispers, "This is not enough," or "This will not last." Even pleasures, when examined closely, are fleeting and often bring attachment, which leads to future pain. The Buddha described 8 fundamental forms of suffering that all beings experience. Birth is suffering, as it begins with struggle and vulnerability. Aging brings decline, making even the simplest tasks difficult. Illness weakens the body and mind, reminding us of our fragility. Death separates us from all we know, creating fear and uncertainty. Beyond these, life is filled with grief from losing what we love, pain from being near what we dislike, frustration when desires go unfulfilled, and the suffering inherent in the impermanent, conditioned nature of all things. Understanding these truths allows us to meet suffering with wisdom rather than resistance. Yet acknowledging suffering is not an act of resignation. It is the first step toward freedom. When we stop running from discomfort and face it with clarity, we begin to understand it. And with understanding comes the possibility of change. Just as a doctor must first diagnose an illness before offering a cure, we must first see suffering clearly before we can transcend it. The Buddha did not stop at describing suffering. He went further, uncovering its cause and its cessation. The first noble truth is only the beginning. Let us now look deeper. Why does suffering arise? The second noble truth, the cause of suffering, Samudaya. If suffering is a fire, what fuels it? The Buddha taught that suffering does not arise by chance. It has causes, and if we understand them, we can begin to free ourselves. The root of suffering lies in 3 poisons: craving, tanha, aversion, dosa, and ignorance, moha. Craving is the restless longing that keeps us chasing after pleasure, security, or identity. It tells us, if only I had this, I would be happy. But the moment we grasp something, fear arises, the fear of losing it, the need for more. Aversion is the opposite, the deep resistance to discomfort, the desire to push away anything unpleasant. We spend much of our lives running from pain, yet the very act of resistance only deepens our suffering. And underlying both is ignorance, the inability to see life as it truly is. We believe that happiness lies in external things, that we are separate from others, that we can hold on to what is constantly changing. At the heart of this cycle is attachment, the habit of clinging to what we desire and resisting what we dislike. When we crave pleasure, success, or approval, we become attached to them, believing they are essential for our happiness. When we fear pain, failure, or loss, we push them away, refusing to accept their place in life. But in both cases, we are caught in a struggle against reality. Imagine holding a rope tightly, believing it will keep you safe, only to realize it is burning your hands. The tighter you cling, the more pain you feel. This is how attachment works. It gives the illusion of comfort, yet it binds us to suffering. Recognizing these causes does not mean we must reject all desires. Not all wanting is harmful. It is natural to wish for well-being or kindness. The suffering arises when we attach to desires with a sense of must-have, when we base our happiness on conditions beyond our control. The Buddha's teaching is clear. Suffering is not imposed upon us by fate. It arises from within, and because it has a cause, it can also have an end. This leads us to the next truth, the possibility of liberation. The third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, Nirodha. If suffering arises from craving and attachment, then what happens when we let go? The Buddha taught that the end of suffering is possible. This is not a vague promise of a distant heaven, nor is it an escape from life. It is a shift in how we relate to existence, an awakening to the peace that is already here when we stop grasping. This state is called nirvana, the extinguishing of craving, like a fire that runs out of fuel. It is not a place, nor an abstract idea. It is freedom from the push and pull of desire and aversion. It is the deep contentment of a mind unburdened by grasping, a heart that is no longer imprisoned by fear. We often think that letting go means losing something. But in truth, it is the opposite. It is releasing the tension, the struggle. Imagine holding water in the hollow of your hands. If you keep your hands open and steady, the water stays there, cool and refreshing. But if you tighten your fingers, fearing it will slip away, the water seeps through the cracks, and soon your hands are empty. In the same way, when we try to cling to life, grasping for pleasure, control, or certainty, it slips away, leaving us anxious and restless. Letting go does not mean losing life's beauty. It means we can finally experience it fully, without fear. This does not mean suffering will never arise again. Pain is a natural part of existence, but with wisdom, it no longer binds us. The Buddha himself experienced illness, fatigue, and eventually death. His body aged and weakened, yet his mind remained undisturbed. When he suffered from sickness, he acknowledged the pain, but he did not resist it with distress. As he approached death, he told his disciples, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence." Even in his final moments, he was free, not because he escaped pain, but because he no longer clung to it. A person who has realized this truth may still experience loss, but they do not drown in sorrow. They may still face challenges, but they do not resist them with fear. Their peace is not dependent on external conditions. It arises from within. Nibbana is not beyond reach. Every moment of mindfulness, of non-attachment, is a step toward it. When we meet life with presence instead of craving, when we release resistance and open to the flow of existence, we taste the freedom the Buddha spoke of. And so, the path forward is clear. The question now is, how do we cultivate this liberation in daily life? The fourth noble truth, the path to liberation, Magga. If suffering has a cause and an end, how do we move from ignorance to wisdom, from attachment to freedom? The Buddha did not leave this as a mystery. He offered a clear way forward, a path of practice, not mere belief. This is the Noble Eightfold Path, a guide to living with clarity, integrity, and inner peace. The Eightfold Path consists of 8 interwoven principles that lead to awakening: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are often grouped into 3 essential aspects of practice: wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Wisdom arises from seeing the world as it truly is, rather than through the lens of craving or delusion. Ethical conduct shapes our interactions with others, ensuring our words and actions are rooted in kindness and honesty. Mental discipline strengthens the mind through mindfulness and meditation, allowing us to cultivate inner stability and insight. This path is not a set of rigid commandments, nor is it something we must follow perfectly from the beginning. It is a gradual process, like tending to a garden. Some areas may already be flourishing, while others require patience and care. Through consistent effort, wisdom and freedom naturally take root. With this foundation, our actions follow. Speech becomes more truthful and gentle. Our daily conduct aligns with integrity. We refrain from harming others, from dishonesty, from acting out of greed or ill will. Even the way we earn a living matters, as a livelihood rooted in exploitation or deceit only deepens suffering. But wisdom and ethical living alone are not enough. The mind must also be trained. Without effort, old habits of craving and aversion will persist. Just as a fire must be fed to keep burning, we must nourish qualities like patience, mindfulness, and right intention. Instead of being pulled by fleeting desires, we learn to cultivate what truly brings peace. Central to this training is mindfulness, being fully present in each moment. Rather than being lost in worries about the past or future, we develop awareness of our thoughts, emotions, and actions. And with mindfulness comes concentration, the ability to steady the mind, to see things clearly without distraction or distortion. Through meditation, this clarity deepens, allowing insight to arise naturally. The Eightfold Path is not a distant ideal. It is something we can walk, step by step, in our daily lives. With each moment of awareness, each act of kindness, each effort to let go of clinging, we move closer to liberation. The journey itself is the unfolding of freedom. The significance of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are not merely the foundation of Buddhism. They are a profound insight into the nature of life itself. They offer a clear, direct path to understanding suffering, its causes, and the way to transcend it. Unlike mere philosophical speculation, these truths are meant to be realized and lived. The first noble truth teaches us to recognize suffering without fear or denial. This is not pessimism but clarity, an invitation to face life as it truly is, rather than as we wish it to be. The second noble truth reveals that suffering is not random. It has causes, primarily craving and attachment. This means that suffering is not inevitable. We are not bound to it. The third noble truth offers hope. Suffering can cease. And the fourth noble truth gives us a practical path to follow, showing that freedom is not a distant ideal, but something achievable through our own effort. These teachings are universal. Whether one considers themselves a Buddhist or not, the principles of recognizing suffering, understanding its causes, and cultivating wisdom and compassion can transform how we experience life. The Four Noble Truths remind us that happiness does not come from external conditions, but from how we relate to them. By walking this path, we cultivate inner peace, not by escaping life's difficulties, but by seeing through them with wisdom. For over 2,500 years, these truths have guided countless practitioners toward greater clarity and freedom. They are not meant to be worshipped or accepted on blind faith, but tested through experience. When we apply them, we begin to see their truth for ourselves. And in that realization, the path unfolds, not as something outside of us, but as a way of being, leading step by step toward liberation. Applying the Four Noble Truths in daily life. The Four Noble Truths are not just philosophical concepts to be understood, but a practical guide for transforming our daily lives. Suffering is something we all encounter: stress, disappointment, loss. But instead of reacting with frustration or avoidance, we can learn to meet it with awareness and wisdom. The first step is recognizing suffering when it arises. This does not mean dwelling in negativity, but simply acknowledging this is suffering. By doing so, we stop running from discomfort and begin to see it clearly. When we understand that suffering is often rooted in craving, whether for success, approval, or control, we can start to loosen our attachment. This does not mean rejecting life's joys, but experiencing them without clinging, knowing that all things are impermanent. The path to peace is not about withdrawing from the world, but engaging with it differently. Practicing right speech means speaking with honesty and kindness, avoiding gossip or harmful words. Right action encourages us to live ethically, making choices that reduce harm to ourselves and others. Even in our work, we can seek a livelihood that aligns with our values. Mental discipline is just as important. In a world full of distractions, practicing mindfulness helps us remain present. Instead of being caught in endless worries about the future or regrets about the past, we can anchor ourselves in the here and now. Meditation strengthens this awareness, allowing us to cultivate inner stability no matter what arises. Applying the Four Noble Truths is not about achieving perfection, but about walking the path step by step. Each moment of mindfulness, each act of kindness, and each effort to let go of grasping brings us closer to true peace. The journey itself is the practice, and every step forward is already a form of freedom. Conclusion. The Four Noble Truths are not just a teaching to be studied, but a reality to be lived. They offer a map, a way to understand suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path to true peace. But a map alone does not take us to the destination. We must walk the path ourselves. At its heart, this teaching is an invitation to see life as it is, to recognize where suffering arises, and to cultivate the wisdom and compassion needed to free ourselves. Each moment of awareness, each act of kindness, each step toward letting go brings us closer to that freedom. Liberation is not found in some distant future. It begins now, in how we meet this very moment. The Buddha did not ask for blind belief, but for exploration. He simply pointed the way, and the journey is ours to take. With patience and sincerity, we begin to see the truth for ourselves. And as we do, the path unfolds, not as something outside of us, but as a way of living, a way of being, a way of peace. May all beings find the courage to seek wisdom, the strength to walk the path, and the joy of true liberation.